Hey, welcome to the final part of our live coding series. So in the previous videos, we took the Arduino keypad element and then we drew it with Inkscape. We exported it to an SVG file, and then we spent a lot of time in Visual Studio Code, tidying all these SVG elements, removing duplicated code, and we even started working on adding the event listener. Now, today, we are going to take the event listener that we only added to one of the keys and make sure that all of the keys in the keypad respond to events. And then, once we are done with that, we'll try to create another version of the keypad that has 3 rows instead of 4 rows. So basically making it configurable. And hopefully, by the end of the day, we'll just commit everything we did and push it into the wild. So let's start. All right, so in order to have the event handlers set on all of the buttons, there are a few approaches that we can take. First of all, we can simply copy paste this like this, but you know, I really don't like this kind of code copy pasting. So there must be a better solution than copy pasting this code. Usually I would go for event delegation, which means that instead of setting up the event handlers on this group element, we'll set it up at a higher level. Like, for instance, we can listen for those events in this upper group. And basically, if we try that, we can see that this group contains all the blue buttons. So now, let's hope this refreshes soon. Yeah, no, it didn't yet. Now it did. So now, whenever I click any of the blue buttons, I actually get an event. So it seems to be working. Not for the red ones yet, because we only added the listeners on the blue buttons. But there is a small issue. So behind the scenes, lead elements use something called shadow DOM. If you look at the elements panel and inspect this nice element, we can see that our entire component is wrapped in something called shadow root. Now, when we add custom event listeners to any of these elements inside the shadow root, in this case, we added the listener to these blue buttons, to this group that contains all the blue buttons. So let's just console log the event that we get. So when we use event delegation, usually we look at the target where the user actually, to find the event where the user actually clicked. Why it's not happy? Because, oh well, because of those keyword listeners. Let's remove them for a moment, just so that compiles and we can see the actual event handler does that is dispatched, the actual event that is created when we click. So, for instance, if I click on 2, I would expect to have some property in the event that would give me the actual element that I clicked on. But since we are inside Shadow DOM, we don't get it. We actually get the event target is the whole custom element, the entire membrane keypad element, and we don't really get to know which actual button was clicked. There is a workaround. There is this path element, this path property that has an array that shows us all the elements that were clicked. And the problem with this one is that it's not really cross-browser. So if we look at the event, it doesn't actually have path property. It's not something standard. But we saw there is a composed path property, which is actually a function, And if we call that function, we just get an empty array. Again, that's because we are inside the shadow DOM. So the bottom of the story, the bottom line here is that event delegation is pretty tricky when you are inside the shadow DOM, and I don't know if you can easily do it in any way that is cross-browser compatible. But luckily there is another way to achieve the same. Let's just restore the keyboard listeners that I removed. Okay, and move back the events to the actual key element, to the group that is this one. So instead of using event delegation to catch the event at a high level and then inside the event figure out which key was pressed, which is what I would probably normally do if we didn't have this shadow DOM thing here, I'm going to use the fact that lit element allows me to compose elements by calling functions, by defining functions that return like a part of the DOM, or in this case, a part of the SVG, and composing them together. So basically similar to how React works with JSX. So I'm going to copy all this niceness and create a new function here, a new method in this class, and call it render key, and it will get x, y, and the text of the key. And basically it's going to return a new SVG template string. This is how we tell lit element that we want it to create an SVG document fragment, and then we can pass the x and y as parameters, and then also the text. So what you are seeing here is, and let's fix the indentation. What you are seeing here is another way to reuse code in the previous way was like with the defs was at the SVG level, and this is reusing code at the lit element level. And now all I need to do is just replace all those let's remove all the event handlers here, so they all look this, all the groups look the same. I just have to replace all those calls with basically calling this new method, render key, and give it the x, y, and the text. So yet again, I'm going to use the multi-cursor, the very useful multi-cursor option of Visual Studio Code. And then I can say call this dot render key with the x and y. This is getting a bit challenging. And then basically cut. This should be the same. Just get the text and close this and remove this. So yeah, we did this refactoring almost successfully. I can see it's not happy about some things. Let's see, first of all, oh, it just wanted to format it differently. Interesting. Just in order to make it less picky about the formatting, let's just, it's definitely less readable this way, but if we wrap each one of those in a group element, it won't be picky about the formatting. So let's do that. No. Alright. So basically close the group, open group, and close these parentheses. Alright, now it's happy. We have this glitch here we can fix. And let's see what we got here. Yep, we got all the keys now they are rendered by render key, so we no longer have to repeat. Let's be consistent and call it red keys and blue keys. So we don't have to repeat all the event listeners and everything. We just have to declare them once inside the render key method. And actually, I think it would be more readable if I change the order of the arguments. So text appeared first, because the text is always one characters, and then X and Y can go crazy. So basically, let's do this edit as well. Just go here, let's do it again. I just go select all of these, and then I go 1, 2, 3. I cut this, remove, go back, and then, okay, it almost works. I will have to do some fixes for those two friends, which for some reason they don't have, for some reason they work differently because they are punctuation. So Visual Studio Code does the edits a bit differently than the others. So we'll fix those manually. And I think we are, yep. Yeah, now it's fine. So I think it's even more readable now. And at this stage, we have the listeners, and we are still missing, so we can move with the keyboard, we can use the space bar to trigger the click events, and we are still missing one thing. We don't know which key was pressed, so we can add this to the event listener. Instead of just calling this.down, we can call this.down and give it the name of the key. So that would be text. And do the same here. And same go for this.app. We would need to give it a text. And also when using the keyboard events, and then we can add text string, or maybe that would be key. This is actually the name of the key. Event. When we dispatch it, I think we can actually specify the name of the property. So new event of button press, and I think that when we create it, we can give it like, no, this just says whether it's bubbling or not. So basically what I want to do, I want to put this key inside the event. Yeah, I need, is there like, so I don't actually remember how to put custom info in, custom data in lit events, but let's see what they say here. They probably have some good example for that. Yep, it's called detail. I need to create a custom event instead of an event, and then I can give it some detail. So the detail would be key. Okay, so I don't even need this helper variable here. I can just dispatch this event. Okay, and then I can do the same here, switch from event to custom event, which is, I should have probably used custom event anyway, even without those details, because this is a custom event. And now let's wait a moment until the page will refresh. And now when I click on each of these, I should see, no, I don't see it here. Interesting. So that's probably some limitation of Storybook. It doesn't tell me like the actual properties of the events. Let's do it differently. Let's go to the stories. So maybe one of the action options will help with that. Depth limit, allow function. Interesting. Let's try to give it a depth of 5 and see if that somehow gets it to print the custom properties. No. And what happens if we simply console log the event? So that's the best way to see. If it actually contains, so the reason I'm doing it, I want to see if the event actually contains this property, this detail. Let's see. Yep, it does contain. So for some reason, Storybook doesn't print that out in the actions. Let's see if we can quickly Google a solution, and if not, we'll just print the events without the actual key. Custom event details Storybook. Oh, yeah, they have an issue for that, of course. Let's see what the situation. It's closed. Blah, 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 blah. Polymer, yeah. The state issue reopen. Yeah. It seems like there isn't really a solution. It was just closed 6 days ago without any solution. Maybe I will add a comment later. Yeah. So anyway, it seems like Storybook doesn't really know how to print these custom events, and this is like out of the scope to fix it now. So we'll just we'll just live with that for now. We did console log, and we know that this custom event actually contained this detail, this key detail. And one more behavior we need to implement. If you remember, the push button versions of down and up, they had this like behavior where if the key was already pressed, it wouldn't dispatch the event. So in this case, if I focus on, let's say, one of the keys with the keyboard and then hold the space bar for a long time, you can see it's dispatching a lot of events. So in order to avoid that, I'm going to use a set object that will hold the list of currently pressed keys. So that would be private pressed keys is a new set of strings. And then whenever I press the button, if I only do this if this pressed does not have the key yet. So I dispatch the event, and I also add it to this.pressed keys. And if and quite the opposite for the app, I want to only dispatch it if the keys has been pressed, and then I can remove it from the that's delete from the set. So after this change, I expect my events to only be dispatched once. Let's see. So, yep. Now with the keyboard, yes, only once. So, yeah, we got this to work as well. What else can we do? So, one last thing before we say goodbye. We wanted to support another variation which doesn't have this ABCD column. So that's what we are going to do next. All right, so we want to make this right column optional, and for that we are going to introduce a property. Actually, we already have a property that was just generated with this element, but we don't really use this. So we are going to rename it and call it tree columns. And that would be false by default. So by default we have 4, but if the user sets this to true, we are going to render 3 columns. And I think, so yeah. So what we are going to do, we are going to create a new, let's close this one. We are going to create another story in Storybook. So right now we have this default state of the membrane keypad. And we'll create another one, and we'll call it, just copy paste, we'll call it 3 columns, actually 3 columns, just as the attribute is called. We don't really need this value. We are not going to use any knobs here, so we can remove them from this story. And this one will just have 3 columns equal to, it doesn't really matter as long as it has a value, it will be set to true on the elite element side. And then once this reloads, we should have the 3 columns variation here on the right. So now let's just check that it got the correct value. We can just quickly put it here before the SVG, just print it, this dot 3 columns. And we expect to see this one say true and then the default one say false. So yeah, the default one says false. And this one also says false. Interesting. Yeah, maybe that's something with dashes. Maybe it should be written this way. Yeah. Let's just ask Google about that. If it does some kind of renaming. Options, attribute, blah, 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 blah. And there must be a way to tell it like how the attribute is called. Configure attributes. Yeah, we can define a converter, but there must be a simpler way. Oh, we can just tell it probably what is the name of the attribute. Yeah, by default it's just without, just all lowercase. So basically, yeah, we can see this now. False versus 1, which is basically true. If we actually wanted it to be true, I think we could have used this syntax, which basically tells it to change the property and not the attribute. And then it would actually be equal to the value true and not get the value that the string value that we put in quotes. NeoPixel, keypad, yeah, now it's false, now it's true. Fine, yep. So now we need to adapt to this new property, basically making all of these buttons disappear when this is true. And we can just do that by adding this template directive. So if this dot 3 columns, then or if not these 3, so maybe we'll it will be easier to follow if we display fourth column only if this dot three columns. So now we can say if we do want to display the fourth column, then we need to render all of these guys here. Yep, and I think we are good now. Maybe we can make this a little bit more compact this way. Yep. And we can also remove this debug print here. Oh, obviously equals not. And then it's not happy about some spaces here. Okay. Yep. Let's fix the indentation. And I think we are good. Yep. Now, for some reason, this debug print didn't disappear. Yep. Now it reloaded. And we can see this is the default state. And this is the three columns. So we are almost there. The fourth column has disappeared. And now we only need to change the width of the element. So basically the width returns multiple times. You can see it like 3 times. And we are going to extract this into a variable. So we'll call it just width. And then we can change the value of this variable based on the display for column. So width would be this value. Actually, we can make it a bit smarter. And if we need to display 3 columns, then we will just subtract from it the width of one button, which we can find where we draw the buttons here. This is the width of a single button. Let's give it a nice name, const button width. Or you know what? We can even do it in a prettier way. Const num columns equals and then we can do something like this. So basically, if we take this number and subtract all of these buttons, no, you know what? Let's make it simpler. Yeah, I changed my mind again. So basically, if we are, because we are not going to support like 2 or 5 columns, so we don't need this code. So basically, the width will be, if we display fourth column, that would be this. Otherwise, it would just be this minus button width. And I think we have one more thing to take into account. Let's wait for this to refresh. So now we expect the element to be a bit narrower. Yep, but we still have to, where did it go? Yeah, so now the SVG is the right size, but we still have to change like this second outline here. So this is the second rect, which is here. And again, we can use a variable, or we can just like put the expression here. If we are in display fourth column, otherwise we just subtract one button width. Let's just call it 4 columns for clarity. Okay, and now I think we should have it working for 3 buttons as well. So membrane keypad for 4 columns, 3 columns, 4 columns, 3 columns. Yeah, one thing we didn't take into account is like that we also have some padding around, like some margin between the button, so we need to remove that margin as well when we resize. So basically, to calculate this margin, we can just look at the delta, how much the difference between the x coordinates of, let's say, the fourth button, that would be this one. Let's open the JavaScript console to do this calculation. So this one and the third button, which is like the hash one. So yeah, so basically this is the width of the button, including the padding, including this margin, I mean. So instead of button width equals this, and then we can call it, let's leave it button width. I think it's, or maybe we can call it column width. That would make more sense, like the width of the column, including the margin. Okay, and now I hope to finally have this ready. So 4 columns, 3 columns. Yep, looks pretty dope to me. Okay, one last thing that I would like to do, just like, you know, for the sake of making this super aligned, you can see that even though these ones are supposed to be on the same like height, they have slightly different sizes. So I think it will be easier if just all the buttons on the same row had the same y coordinate. So for the first row, we can see it's 10.91, which is fine. But for the second row, we see that these are not all the same. So let's just make all of them 25, 25, 25, and here again. And let's see. Yeah, the next row has the same problem, like the numbers are sort of similar, but they are not the same. So let's just find a nice middle ground. It would be 32.3, 32.3, 32.3, 32.3, and then the same problem with the last one. We actually got a pretty big deviation here. So actually, it seems like the difference should be around, if we had the mechanical drawing, we could have like used the real measures, but here it's just an approximation. So basically I see that the difference here is a bit more than 14, and here it's like 14.3. So in order to make this consistent, let's make sure that it's always a 14.3 difference. And then that would be 0.6. Just choose some arbitrary number so that the difference between every two rows are consistent, even though I think it should be, let's see. Yeah, it seems pretty consistent now. And we can do the same with the columns because they also have like different coordinates. So basically that would be 7.2. We are just doing approximations here. 7.2. And then for the second, that would be just 22. And should be another one somewhere. 22 and 22. And then the third one, I would say 37, 37, 37. This is also 22. Then this is also 37. And then the last one, let's see, this is 15. Let's make it consistent. So like this, let's make this 7. So it will be 15 as well. and then these all can be 52, 52, 52, 52. So basically what we did here, we made sure that the spacing or between the buttons is pretty much even, like the margins are even. And I think now the code is even easier to understand, where you don't have all these floating point numbers that don't make a lot of sense. So I probably should have done it earlier when I copy pasted the code from Inkscape. But now after I refactored all the repeated code to a different function, it was really easier to see like the patterns here and to make the numbers work. And I think with that, we actually finished the initial working. No, there is one more thing. I see that the text here is selectable, and this is quite annoying, like that if you move the text, the cursor, you select the text. So let's make the text unselectable. Basically, I think it's user selection or something like that, but Google will help. Yep, user select none. Who uses Internet Explorer? Nobody, I hope. Okay, this is not going to work on Internet Explorer anyway because of the the shadow DOM and custom elements. All of that is not really supported on Internet Explorer. Yep, and now the text can no longer be selected, so it's much more fun to work with this. All right, so I think at this stage we are done and we can finally commit our work. We are not going to commit the SVG file. It was just like a temporary way to transfer the graphics from Inkscape to our code. What we are going to commit is like, let's go full screen on this one. What we are going to commit is like the of course, the new web element we just created, and the story. And we also want to commit the index file that exports this element, so it will be available for the users of this library. And let's add commit message, add membrane keypad element. Now, if we had a linked issue in GitHub, we would also write the number of this issue, but in this case, I was a bit lazy and I didn't create an issue for this element. Now we are going to commit and push, and the next time you will go to elements.walkwe.com to this web page, you will see the new element. It will take GitHub a few moments to publish this to Netlify, and it will go online so the rest of the world can start using and tinkering with our membrane keypad element. So I hope you enjoyed this little walkthrough of how do I create a new element, this little live coding experiment. This was my first time doing this, so I hope you find it valuable. And if you also like to get your hands dirty and try all of these technologies that I showed you, just go to the Walkwe Elements repository. We have quite a few open issues. Walkwe Elements, you can see here we have right now we have 5 elements that you can help us implement, and I guess that over the time there will be more. So we are accepting pull requests. Thank you and goodbye.